With disasters and uncertainty always looming, there's never been a better time to start looking at which place is best for prepping. Man-made disasters, natural disasters, economic policies that fail, ensuring your stability for you and your family is absolutely paramount now more than ever. Recent events and pandemics, of which over the last 10 years has been numerous, as well as economic policies that have quite well and truly failed most of the population in the last 20 years and even longer than that. Natural resources are becoming even more strained due to population growth and mismanagement, and wars over these resources are going to become more and more common as we see it. It's not going to be impossible to see that wars over things like water and various agricultural land will actually become a thing of the future, because wars over resources in the past have been fought, and there are actually cases of this already happening. So looking at which place is best for prepping is going to be really important coming forward in the next few years, as well as disasters and other things like that happening around the world. There's also climate change. Climate change itself is going to pose a huge problem for many people around the world, on the coastal communities, as well as those who live in kind of temperate areas like deserts that are going to become even more dry, or cold areas that will become even more warm and might see more rainy seasons or more heavy snow. There's so many variables to include in global climate change that it's going to be very important to research where you live or where you plan to go, so that you can make the right decisions depending on what the future might look like in those areas. Now, in this video, I'm going to cover 4 different land-based places for prepping. We're going to start with cities. We're going to look at towns, we're going to look at rural communities like villages, and then we're going to look at wilderness kind of communities, or out in the wilderness by yourself. We're not going to cover things like boats and RVs or any kind of like camper van type of scenarios. That will be for another video, because those have their own disadvantages and advantages based on where you are. Depending on your location will depend on what's important to you. There are obviously some universal things that everyone needs, such as water, food, subsistence, and safety, but these things are variable depending on where you live. But there are also other things to consider where you live. So you might have economic things in your area, you might have population issues in your area, you might have natural disasters if you live near volcanoes or earthquakes, for example. Then those things might become more difficult later if there are less government institutions around to help you, or if shit hits the fan type of scenario that you might not get any assistance at all. So it's important to take into these things when looking at where you're going to go. Now, in this video, I'm going to outline a few positives and negatives of each area, and then hopefully this will help you choose which place is going to be best for you. Before I go into this, it's important to remember that there are many other factors to include in this. Your finances, for example, may restrict whether or not you can or cannot move at this point. There are also issues around whether you have work right now, and the finances that you get from work, from a salary for example, can actually fund your prepping activities. But if you move away from that area and you don't have an income, then you may actually find it harder to prepare for some kind of disaster. So if you live in a metropolitan area and you cannot leave it, then it's a good idea to prep for being in that area, and whether that could be bugging in or bugging out is going to be variable depending on where you live. But financial constraints are going to play a huge important role for many people in this case, so please do take that into consideration when planning your future. Likewise, if you live in a rural area, there's also some issues to consider. There are disadvantages to living in a rural area, and there are also some advantages. So again, depending on where you live and what your current situation is right now is going to have a huge impact on how you make your decisions going forward. Now that's out the way, we can move on. We're going to start with the first one, cities. Cities are basically huge microcosms of economic activity, people, society, culture. It's basically been one of the greatest inventions of the human age, really. And basically what a city is a combination of economic activity, educational and government institutions, as well as all the kind of social and cultural interactions that we as humans tend to desire. Cities themselves are efficient to deliver lots of things. However, for the classification of this video, we are going to classify cities as areas that are very heavily populated with very little green space and rely very heavily on bringing goods in, which most cities tend to do so these days. A city basically is going to be our place where humans are living in an efficient manner when it comes to what they can access and have things quickly. So for example, supermarkets having deliveries very quickly and routinely, functioning on a kind of just-in-time basis, which is what most supermarkets do. And essentially, if anything were to stop outside the city, then things in the city would lose their resources, for example. So we're going to keep cities within that kind of classification. Now, some positives of cities include people. Now, people actually can also be seen as a negative, but in this case, positive is what we're going to look at for this part of the video. Positives include things like specialized knowledge, specialized training. The likelihood of finding someone during a kind of disastrous event in a city is much, much higher if you need something very specific. Due to population also, cities tend to be on the priority for receiving aid and restructuring after really bad events. This is because there's just more people, and it makes more logical sense and economic sense for a government to restructure those areas because there's just a lot more people to assist within a smaller space. So this is also a benefit of that. Of course, in a SHTF scenario, this will be very different. But in a kind of SHTF scenario, or kind of a normal disasters, things that we're used to, then this is basically what will happen. Cities also have everything. Things that would otherwise be really hard to find. We're talking about specialty items that in rural communities might be difficult to find. And cities, of course, have basically everything. We're talking electronics to chemicals to specialty types of medicines that might be more uncommon in rural areas. So these are also things to consider. Those are two real positives. We're talking about knowledge and we're talking about specialty items. In a kind of grid down SHTF scenario, these things obviously can vary based on where you are. But in general, most cities tend to have these things. Now, let's moving on to the negatives of cities. Of course, people is a negative too. During these kind of situations, you can end up with lots and lots of people clamoring for less and less resources. That becomes a huge issue, of course, as well as rising crime. Competition and rising crime, of course, contribute to huge problems later. Even in short-term disasters, it doesn't actually take much to bring a city down to its knees. It just takes sometimes protesting for things to slow down. So in a disaster or full grid down SHTF scenario, you're talking that the likelihood of crime and this competition for resources is absolutely guaranteed. This is for sure. So really it's going to be based on where you live and what community you have around you, will base on whether or not this is a good place for you to stay. But it's important to take into consideration that for people can become your biggest enemy, and also in times of need could be your biggest ally and help when you need it. And now the negative of a city, especially cities that lack green space, is going to become an issue for growing. Now there are lots of ways to grow food: aquaponics, hydroponics, aeroponics. There are loads of ways which don't really need a lot of land at all. However, immediately after these kind of situations happen, finding the equipment for this, whilst might be easier in a city, you're going to need something up and running really quickly, and therefore land tends to be the quickest way to do that until you find the items you need. So cities will run out of food very quickly. In fact, most cities around the world, most companies operate a kind of system of just-in-time delivery for food for supermarkets. And most supermarkets, at least in Europe, tend to focus on a 3-day stock. The United States also does something very similar. So most of the world functions on a kind of just-in-time delivery with about 3 days more or less of food in the storage for these supermarkets. So 3 days is not that much, and if you haven't stocked up before something happens, it's already too late. So it's important to consider that. Towns are basically just small versions of cities. However, we're classifying towns in this video separately from cities because there are lots of towns in the world that are basically have some similarities with cities, but surrounding them have a lot of farmland and have a lot of smaller villages that supply that town. So really, whilst they are still dependent on their surrounding space, it is a kind of more micro economy, if you want to put it that way, where they do have support from the surrounding area and farms and stuff like that. Now, during SHTF scenarios, of course, like there's going to be some resource depletion. This is going to be normal. However, when it comes to issues around having some basic necessities covered, the surrounding villages and the surrounding farmland should be able to supply the local town if it's not requisitioned by the government or other people or gangs later down the line. But towns themselves do offer some similar advantages to cities. You're talking about community of people. You might better find resources that would be otherwise harder to find in more rural spaces. So people is positive here, but people is also a negative. So it's basically important to weigh up, what is your town like? Is it an area that's quite close-knitted community, or is it basically going to be an issue of free-for-all as soon as anything goes bad? What's the history of that town look like? Is there been any issues in the past where things have gone down and people have banded together to help, or has crime gone up? Now, maybe this is not going to be the case in the future. You shouldn't use this as a guideline, but definitely keep it in consideration when thinking about, is this town going to be a good place if things go south? So that's just basically the same. Cities and towns in this video are going to basically be roughly the similar thing. The only difference being that in a city, of course, there's a lot more people, and with a lot more people comes a lot more competition for resources. So basically the best way of looking at this is a town is kind of like a diet city. It has all the same problems, has all the same benefits as a city, pretty much. Whereas in a town, you might actually find more green space. Getting out of the town will be easier, especially if the town is not too big. You might better get out onto the highways and into the kind of countryside much quicker. In some cities around the world, like Los Angeles, New York, London, it might take you hours. Whereas obviously in towns, you might be able to get out in 20 minutes. So it's important to consider that if your plan includes getting out of Dodge, then basically consider that towns might be a good option for you rather than a city. And if you live on the edge of a city, then of course you could get out quick as well. But basically for this video, we are classifying towns separately. Rural communities. Rural communities like villages, this is something that we're going to look at. Now, rural communities do get a lot of praise from preppers, and for very good reason. Rural communities tend to be very close-knitted. There are some really great positives to rural communities. Normally there's a lot of land access available. Normally the land is quite cheap. Rural communities do tend to look after each other better. That's mostly due to the fact of one of the negatives of rural communities, which is access to resources. There's a lot of items and specialty items of knowledge that are missing in rural communities, so you do rely on your neighbors a bit more, especially during difficult situations. Finding the knowledge that you need during these situations might be more difficult in a rural community, so this is also a negative to consider. However, when you're considering about knowledge, whilst you may be able to find these things in cities, again, finding it during a grid down situation might be difficult. So the difficulty of finding someone you need, like a surgeon, might be difficult in a city during a grid down situation, and might be difficult in a village depending on where you live. So it's really important to consider that whilst the land may be cheap and whilst the community might be tight knitted, it really depends on who is in that community, what do they have, what can they possibly produce. For example, if you need specialty medicine, the town itself, the village that you're living in, the rural community, maybe only have a few days supply, and then you've basically got to travel into the local towns and cities to go and get it, because producing specialty medicines, for example, is not something that a small rural community will be able to do. Factories that produce medicines and companies that have more stock and warehouses, those tend to be located in towns and cities, so it's important to consider the location and proximity of a rural community to larger areas that you may be able to find things that you need. This is why at the start of the video we discussed things like, what is your personal needs? if you need certain medicines, then you're going to have to take that into serious consideration. You may have to weigh up the fact that living in a more dangerous area might be better for you if you've got access to more medicine. Finally, we're going to look at wilderness. Wilderness is basically, we're classifying it in this video as essentially not even in a rural community, but you and a group of your people that you've got together, your prepping circle, your bug out group, whatever you want to call it, and basically just getting the hell out of everywhere and just living by yourself in the forest or some other coastal area, wherever you may be. Now, of course, there are some positives to this. You're basically removing any issue of people. Crime and the competition for resources is going to be almost negligible, which is obviously great. And of course, if you've got a very skilled group, then you could survive quite well. If you've got people who can hunt, prepare food, filter water, maybe someone who's good with electronics and communication, that also could be very useful. But that's really going to be very, very heavily dependent on the group that you're in. And if you have no group, then you probably need to rule out this option entirely, because it's almost certainly going to make your life harder. Negatives are numerous for this. Access to resources is basically going to be next to impossible. And that's going to be a huge problem. Your entire life, the time during these situations are going to be essentially down to subsistence. You're going to have to forage and hunt literally every day until something surprising comes along to fix that. Because essentially in that scenario you don't even have electricity. You're going to have a real big struggle with storing food. You're going to have to go out and get it all the time. If someone gets ill, you're going to need to venture into the rural communities, which may not let you in, into the towns and cities. And if you've got a small group and someone goes in to go and find medicine in a city and doesn't return because something bad happens, then you've lost a huge member of your team. And you've lost resources that they've taken with them, for example, to either barter or any weapons or anything like that. So it's a huge risk in that respect. Finding knowledge is going to be almost impossible. The longer a scenario tends to go on, the longer a disaster tends to go on. Communities tend to be more distrusting of outsiders. This has been shown throughout history. So basically, if you need a surgeon and then a bunch of random forest people turned up to a rural community, the rural community will be very pensive and very distrusting of a group just coming in, and especially if you have nothing to offer, and if they're in a desperate situation, that could end up going south very quickly. So it might be best to not consider this as an option unless you have a very organized group that's very well stocked and has a good plan for getting in and out of cities and towns to get resources, or to have the ability to better build something up in your little group. If you know a really good bug out location, for example, and you've got some solar panels and some batteries and some ways of growing food and things like that, then probably you could haul that stuff out to some place and tuck yourself away. You're still going to be struggling with the fact of medicine, because medicines don't last forever, and if you've got any people in your group who needs medicine, for example, that's going to be a priority, because if you lose someone in your group, it can be a huge loss, not just for the skill set that person might have, but also morale. It's one of the biggest overlooked areas of basically prepping. Psychology and morale is a huge factor in these scenarios. If you look during the coronavirus pandemic this year, last year, what you're basically seeing is huge amounts of depression, some suicides, because of just the sheer length of time. We are social creatures. We strive for human interaction. Even people like me, who is kind of IT nerds who prefer not to go outside, everyone needs social interaction. So it's important to consider, what does your group look like in this situation? Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. I hope that you enjoyed the video. I hope the tips were helpful. I hope that you found some positives and negatives in there. And I will see you in the next video. Nordic Brit out.